What we really wanted to try to do was help make cities work better and function better from a transportation perspective, and also reduce the carbon impact that they have. In many ways, you can often look at someone's career trajectory and think, looking backwards, that it all seems so linear and obvious. But in the moment, or even sort of, if you rewind back to the sort of the origins, you may have no idea that that was going to transpire, and that all these sort of happenstance come along to help create and guide a career progression. So I think that's totally true. I think it's easy to look back and be like, oh, it's very logical that, Andrew might have gone from government to the solar industry to clean mobility, but it was definitely not part of any master plan by any means.
What if getting around your city didn't harm the planet? Andrew Savage is the co-founder of Lime, the micromobility company that put e-scooters and e-bikes on the streets around the world. Today, Lime operates in hundreds of cities globally, proving that sustainable transportation can be both convenient and wildly scalable. Welcome to Reinventing Capitalism, the podcast where I, Claudia Thomas, decode the success of for-profit impact businesses through the stories of their founders. Our goal is to inspire you towards a purpose-driven career, because life's too short for boring jobs and soul-crushing corporations. Quick note before we get back to the episode, just give me 30 seconds of your time. Two things. The first is a huge thank you for listening and tuning into the show week after week. It means the world to me. And the second is that we are just getting started. If you enjoy what we do here, please join the 14% of people that listen to this podcast regularly and follow us on this app. I promise to do everything in my power to make this show as good as I can, now and into the future. Thank you. Andrew, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming. I think I'll just go and start straight from the start. I wanted to start by understanding a little bit about your background. As far as I'm concerned, you are from the US, you have worked in different corporations, you worked in government and climate policy. But I want to really understand who was Andrew, not from a work perspective, but rather as a person. I want to understand what shaped you to make you want to build something and want to do something different with your career.
Yeah, well, happy to have that conversation. So I grew up in a pretty rural part of Vermont, in the northeastern part of the United States. And we didn't live on a farm, but we essentially did all the things that you might do on a farm. Like, my mom was in the garden growing vegetables that we would eat and, freeze and eat throughout the year. And my dad was out there, cutting firewood to help us heat the house. And we really lived in a way that was very connected to the land. And I was immersed in this environment and was much, to my chagrin as a child, brought into that labor and doing the work and helping out. And really that foundation helped form some of the, I would say, almost like conservation or environmental ethic that I developed over time. And, I had a couple siblings, and we also were immersed in an entrepreneurial environment as well. My mom actually started she's an artist, and she started essentially a ornament making business where she actually would sort of weave these grasses and make ornaments. And my dad actually started a business running a baseball camp for adults to go essentially play baseball with former professionals. So I was also immersed in this sort of entrepreneurial environment. And I think with my siblings and my family, we were sort of in this place where we had this tight connection to the land and a tight connection to being industrious and creating things. So that really is something that has struck with me, and one that has sort of been, I think, a common thread throughout the work that I've done professionally.
Yeah. So it seems that part of this entrepreneurial spirit came from your family, the people that you probably learned from the most, at least at a very young age. When does the idea of mobility start to come into the picture?
Yeah, I mean, I would say much later. And the thing I didn't mention was that growing up in rural Vermont, I grew up on a very rugged and remote dirt road that was just wide enough for a single car to pass. So if another car was coming, you sort of find a place to pull off in between the trees, quite literally. And that couldn't be farther from the types of environments that we now operate lime in, from Chicago and Los Angeles to London and in Paris, right? So
Yeah.
there is a little bit of irony in terms of the upbringing of being in a very rural environment to the work that we do at the core of Lime's mission, which is, hyper urban. I would really say that the mobility aspect came as maybe an offshoot from the work I had done in the solar industry. So I spent 6 years working in solar, and we both manufactured a solar product and developed projects. And as part of working in renewable energy, we were constantly in the 2010 to 2017 era talking about essentially electrifying everything, that as an industry, we were going to be able to produce the renewable energy that could fuel the future economy. And that future economy meant things like electric vehicles or air source heat pumps to heat and cool homes, all straight on down the list. And so part of that really was thinking about transportation. How do we think about electrifying transportation so that transportation could be powered by clean, renewable energy? And essentially, the next step, which wasn't necessarily by design, but just sort of as life took it, was happening into a conversation with Toby and Brad, who were thinking about starting Lime. And very quickly, it became clear that they would need some help and help on the government affairs and policy side of things, which is where I started at the company.
So it was Toby and the other co-founder, and what's his name again? Sorry.
Brad, yep.
Brad, exactly. And you who started Lime.
There were six of us,
Okay.
and yeah, across various different sort of core components to within the company, technology and hardware and operations. And so, yeah, that was in January of 2017.
Wow. It seems like so far away, but also it's just around the corner.
For both of us, yeah, it's an
Yeah.
amazing how quickly it has gone. And in many ways that now, 8.5 years ago feels like an eternity ago as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I can feel that too. How did you meet them?
Yeah, we met through a colleague in the solar industry. In fact, my family, we were moving out west, and at the time, I had assumed that I would stay within the renewable energy industry. I, at the time, was serving on the Solar Energy Industry Association board of directors, which represented the solar industry. Of course, California has an enormous plethora of solar and renewable energy companies. And my assumption was in a move west that I would stay within the same sector. But I had by chance met with Toby and Brad through a colleague who knew that I had spent the last year living with my family in Bogota. And as part of living in Bogota, I had become immersed within the cycling and biking scene of the city and beyond and outside of the city. And while I'd never been sort of I would say like an urban cyclist, he knew that I was out there in Bogota doing all this biking with a bike team and with, within and outside of the city. And when I met with him out in California and told him that I was looking for a next career, something, of course, in sustainability, something that would help advance our addressing the climate crisis, he sort of put two and two together and said, hey, you've got to connect with Toby and Brad. They're starting to think about this company of doing bike sharing at the time. And we met for coffee and sort of the rest is history.
Wow. Sometimes things just happen serendipitously, and there's no other
Yeah,
explanation.
yes, I think that's exactly true. I think in many ways you can often look at someone's career trajectory and think, looking backwards, that it all seems so linear and obvious. But in the moment, or even sort of, if you rewind back to the sort of the origins, you may have no idea that that was going to transpire, and that all these sort of happenstance come along to help create and guide a career progression. So I think that's totally true. I think it's easy to look back and be like, oh, it's very logical that, Andrew might have gone from government to the solar industry to clean mobility, but it was definitely not part of any master plan by any means.
Yeah, no, I feel that like my life also happened in the same way. I totally feel where you're coming from. I feel that a lot of people see scooters and e-bikes on the street, but they don't really see the bigger picture. Can you tell us a little bit about the problem that life is really solving?
Yeah, I mean, the transportation sector accounts for a third of all of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the largest sector within that third is private mobility and cars. And so, in many ways, we're after addressing that very, very large carbon problem. And when we started the company, really the goal was and continues to be helping solve what we call like the first and last mile transportation challenge within cities, that you can get into a city, for example, often via mass transit, or you can get, operate within the city, via, a subway or a bus. But often there's like disconnects where you might have the end of that journey or the beginning of that journey have a big gap of, a mile or 2 or 3 kilometers if you're in other parts of the world. And, the challenge was that there wasn't a great solution for that. And we certainly don't think that a car is a great solution for that. It's both, they are costly, they are produce congestion within cities, and obviously have an enormous carbon impact. And so what we really wanted to try to do was help make cities work better and function better from a transportation perspective, and also reduce the carbon impact that they have. So, we can talk about this, but there's just obviously enormous benefits if you can think about using 2 wheels instead of four, having zero emissions versus highly emitting vehicles. When you're really just trying to move a person around, it shouldn't take such a mass amount of energy and resources and space to do that. And so really the foundation was thinking, can we do transportation better, more efficiently, and can we help solve some of the challenges that we saw within cities around the United States initially, and then obviously now globally?
Yeah, it seems that it's quite obvious the effect that it's having on the environment, but it requires a change in mindset to move from like using traditionally the car for everything to moving to a two-wheel electric mode of transportation. What are the benefits for citizens that maybe people are not aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty extensive. I mean, if you think about how much space cars take up within cities, in virtually every city that we could list, it's enormous, right? You have cars that are parked on the side of the road next to the curb, which is taking space. You have cars that are parked in parking garages, taking up space, and these cars sit idle 96% of the time. And that's not even accounting for the space that it takes with sort of actual traffic lanes of once they're in motion. And so if you think about the flip side, if you can get rid of the need for all that parking, the curbside space could be used for protected bike lanes. It could be used for eateries outside of restaurants. The parking garages that I mentioned could be used for housing to allow people to live closer to where they work so that they can have a higher quality of life. Really what we're talking about is greater livability within cities and greater sustainability within cities. So you can make cities function better, you can make them more affordable, you can have people simply just be happier and have more joy within cities. So really the problem is that we have built many, many cities centered around cars, and we're really hoping to help provide a solution that can pull back on that and allow people to get around efficiently, with zero emissions, and in a way that actually brings some joy and livability to their life within cities.
Yeah. And this is a big, big problem that you're solving from the urban mobility perspective to the climate perspective as well. What made you like take the courage to, like move from, I guess, the corporate or the safe sector towards starting a startup in a moment where you had your family, you were in Colombia? Like, what was that inner, like intuition, I guess, that made you say yes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure it was like overly strategic of a decision, but I guess I've always been someone who likes to take on challenges. In fact, I remember when I went to college, I was deciding on university choices, and I wanted to ski race, and I hadn't had the pedigree of a traditional ski racer in North America, where you go to a elite ski academy and you have all these rankings. And I remember speaking with the ski coach, and he essentially said that I should go to a competitor school, so compete against them. And I remember thinking, you know what, like he's probably right, and in fact, he was right that it might have been a better fit, but that just wasn't the school that I wanted to go to. And to pull on that thread a little bit further, my mom also said, "Hey, I think this school that you want to go to has too much reading. It's going to bury you." And she was also probably right, because it buried me, and it took a ton of hard work. But I decided not to listen to either of that advice, and in terms of going to school, and forged ahead, walked onto the ski team, and had a great ski career for 4 years there. And and ended up doing just fine in college as well, despite the level of reading. And, maybe
Mhm.
share that example in that I think that I, in many ways, see a challenge and enjoy trying to find a solution or forging ahead and pushing, for a solution. And so, I think that the notion of being able to take on and start essentially an entirely new industry, at the time in 2017, what we were doing was called dockless bike share. You don't even hear about that term anymore, dockless bike share. It's really now called
No.
micromobility. And that didn't even come on the scenes as a term or as an industry until 2018 or 2019. So in some ways, I just relish in the idea of tackling new things, feeling like we're sort of at the cutting edge of building something. And it maybe comes a little bit also from that sort of entrepreneurial background that we talked about at the outset. I
Yeah.
do like to create things.
Yeah. Did you feel fear at any point?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways, I think you can't not feel like there's some sense of could this fail or is this too risky? But I also think it's worth putting it into the context of, what's the worst thing that can happen? You sort of have to retrench and start something new or find a new industry, et cetera. So in many ways, I think it was the interest and the desire to start something new and create something far outweighed the potential risk or fear of failure.
Yeah, that's a very good reflection because if you actually put yourself in the worst case scenario, you realize that it might not be that bad of a scenario. Like you can always get out of it and you probably can learn a lot for whatever happens next if you actually fail.
I think that's exactly right. In many ways, I think you learn the most from failure, and I think you can learn an awful lot by being reflective of the things that might have caused that failure. And no one wants to fail. You don't go into something thinking that you're going to. You have to hope and forge ahead and expect that you're going to be successful. But it's also not the worst thing in the world to fail. I
No.
early in my career, before going into government, I worked on a number of political campaigns. And in a political campaign, usually it's one winner and one loser. You kind of go into it, especially if it's a tough campaign, with maybe a 50-50 chance of a success and a
Yeah.
50-50 chance of a failure. And I think you learn that there's a ton that can be gained from taking that risk and forging ahead. And if you're successful, obviously, great things can happen.
Yeah, and that also makes me think that it's about trusting that clarity will come once you start moving. You cannot know what's going to happen if you don't take any actions.
Absolutely. That is very true.
So if someone's listening that feels stuck in a job that it's maybe meaningless or that it's not, solving a problem that they really care about, what is something that they can do towards finding more meaningful work? Do you have an advice for that?
I actually just recently, this week, in fact, heard an executive on our team say that they have what they call a regrets weekend once every 6 months or so. And what he does is he thinks about all of the ways that he's currently living his life and what regrets will his 80-year-old self have about how he's living his life. And that really struck me, and I think is maybe an appropriate answer to that question. That I think it's really worth thinking about and reflecting on from time to time because we really often don't pause and reflect on what we're doing in our day to day. But I think there's some real value in that and thinking, okay, what has me stuck? Am I getting meaning from the work that I'm doing? And what might I be able to change? And, there's different gradients of how you can change. I mean, you can quit your job the next day, toss your computer out the window, and then start fresh. Or there's other ways you can do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you can also start to think about, all right, do I volunteer? Do I advise? Do I help get involved in something that is giving me meaning in a way that doesn't require an entirely radical change in circumstances? So I think there's a continuum, right? There's nothing wrong with scrapping everything and starting new. And there's also nothing wrong with taking a first step and thinking about a way to live more deliberately or choose something that has a little more meaning. So I think I just would encourage folks to think about ways that they can do that. And I thought that the regrets weekend concept was a really fascinating one. I hadn't heard that before, and I've worked with him for a number of years, and I was struck by it. And it's one that I'm hopeful that I can emulate a bit as well.
Me neither. I'm gonna start doing it because you do bucket lists, but you don't do regret lists. And
Yeah, I think it's
actually,
right.
you're gonna feel you're gonna feel worse if you regret things rather than just not having done something that you wanted to do. Like regret is always feels heavier.
Yep, I think that's right. I mean, I do think that, I've also heard commonly referred to, and maybe you've heard this, that people ask, like, will you really care about this when someone's reading your eulogy and, reflecting on your life? Like, are you living your life in a way that your future eulogy would sort of benefit from, or is it the one that you want? And, I think that's always a tricky one because it's a similar concept, but it's also a little lofty, and also no one wants to really think about their own death either. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit of a tricky one, but I think there's ways to think about it in a more deliberate way and really reflect and think about what the changes that can be made are.
Yeah. Hi, can I ask you a quick favor? Every week, we dive into the stories of founders that do more than just make money. Our mission is to prove that a career in impact can be both purposeful and financially sustainable. If you believe in creating meaningful work, share today's episode with one friend who's ready to make a difference. It would mean a great deal to me. Your support is what keeps this show alive and growing. Thank you. Something that I've noticed across founders is that when you start a new idea, it is unconventional at the moment when you found it. Like Lime, for example, I assume micromobility back then, like no one had heard of the word micromobility.
Right.
So how do you convince skeptical city leaders or people that you wanted to trust in Lime to take you seriously?
Yeah, that was a huge challenge. I mean, when we started the company, in many ways, we were up against the competition of the incumbent bike share industry, which had been city government funded. They were using infrastructure like docking stations, as you see in some parts of the world still. And so we were trying to find ways to operate within a very difficult environment, and we had zero operational experience. So I can remember making phone calls to contacts that I developed either in New York City or Austin and having good conversations about what we were proposing, but we had zero operational experience. And a city like Austin or New York City is not going to take a company's word for it with zero experience. And I remember a really formative conversation with a former mayor of Philadelphia, and what he said, I remember him sort of pounding on the table for effect, and he essentially said, "You've got to crawl, you've got to walk, you've got to run." And I remember like repeating that: crawl, walk, run. And what that really meant was like you've got to crawl as a company to build that experience and that trust and that operational history and learn before you can be out sprinting and expecting to operate in a city like Austin or New York City. And so we did that. We started working within smaller markets that didn't have those incumbent bike share programs, that really thirsted for a transportation alternative. So we went into markets like Greensboro, North Carolina. The University of Greensboro invited us in, and so we launched a program there. Lake Tahoe in California, some of our earliest markets were very, very small markets. But what it did was it gave us operational experience so we could learn, so we could improve. And then, within months, the city of Seattle was asking for an alternative to their bike share program. We were there in a position to be able to serve the city there and really grew from there. So we really followed that crawl, walk, run model. And ultimately now we're, in approximately 30 countries around the globe, operating in some of the biggest cities in the world. Because we did that. And, we had competitors that didn't take that approach and they don't exist anymore. And I think in many ways we followed that path and built that trust with cities because ultimately cities as a key stakeholder for us, they're our key customer, right? We have to serve them well and we have to do well by them or they're not going to let us operate.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting how actually starting small and learning about like managing small operations can actually be the path to success. Because as a founder, I assume that oftentimes like you see more of the vision of where you want to get to rather than your day to day when you are starting. And that can be very misleading because then you might not be prioritizing building the right skeleton to then scale scale while being strong already.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we certainly had the vision that we would be operating in Chicago, DC, New York, Austin, LA, but that we needed to earn that trust within cities, gain operational experience, and be able to be in a position where we could do so successfully. So, for example, if one of those major cities had, through a stroke of luck, said yes, would we really have been ready to have served them well? Probably not. We needed to
Yeah.
have the operational experience in a smaller market to be able to grow as a company, to be able to learn as an operational team to function well. And I think it's really about learning along the way. And to your point, having that vision, like we did have that vision of operating in some of the largest cities in the world, and that's exactly what we're now doing. It doesn't mean that you have to abandon the vision. It's just that you have to see the steps along the way to get there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Do you remember something that might have gone wrong that you were not expecting? And do you remember how you fixed it?
Well, maybe I could think of two things. I wouldn't say it was gone wrong, but just more that it was more challenging than expected. I think the first is that during that period when we were trying to get into those first markets, it was clear that cities had no idea how to regulate us. Some cities said
Mm,
when we would come to them, they'd say, well, I think if you just get a business license, you can operate. And that was one path. Or we might treat you like a concession because like a concession, like a vendor that might be selling like t-shirts or hot dogs on the sidewalk because your vehicles are going to be parked uh, for rent out on the sidewalk. Cities did not have any sense of how to regulate this new industry. And so that was a challenge, and that we had to, in many ways, co-create that with those cities. So, we worked hand in glove with them to figure, all right, what makes sense? How can we structure, a service agreement, for example, that would be good for the city and work for the business? So I think that was the biggest, one of the bigger surprises was number one was nobody knew how to regulate the industry. So we really had to create regulations. You fast forward today, 8+ years later, and cities have requests for proposals, RFPs, tender offers, depending on what market you're in, where they're essentially saying that they want 2 or 3 operators, for example, and these are the rules of the road, and we're going to select the most qualified, best operator. And we have a very, very high success rate with those tenders, those RFPs, because of our operational performance. But it took a long time to get to the point where cities were then sort of requesting the service versus sort of figuring out how to regulate us, or frankly, sometimes hostilely trying to avoid have us be in a market. We've really overcome that significantly.
what is part of this regulation that you built? Like, is it how many vehicles can be in a city, where they should be parked, in which areas can they operate? Like, yeah, like how was that process? Because I guess like you could have tried to build regulations to your advantage, of course.
Well, there
No?
was yeah, totally. But there was a benefit in having it be mutually beneficial because we wanted successful programs, right? We wanted our city partners to be happy with the service, and we wanted riders to be happy with the service. So, we spent a lot of time and still spend a lot of time thinking about what is the right fleet number in a market to
Mm,
serve the market based on density and population and commute patterns. What are some parking solutions that can be helpful and advantageous both to the city and to riders so that people have a sense of where they can park, where they can't. We have done things using like technology solutions like requiring riders to take pictures of the end of their trip, where how they've parked, as a forcing mechanism to have people think about how did they park the vehicle and did they park it in an appropriate spot. So, those are things that we have developed along the way, both from a technology perspective and a regulatory perspective, where we've thought, okay, how can we create an environment where there will be a successful micromobility industry at large? And then we obviously have to figure out how to run the business within that.
thanks for that example. Lime's promise isn't just mobility, actually. It's also carbon reduction, which is what we were talking about earlier. Lime has grown 30% year on year in the past 4 years. And you guys are also achieving double-digit reduction in carbon emissions. This is exactly the premise of Reinventing Capitalism, of the podcast. How can business performance and climate progress in this case go hand in hand?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and you're right. I mean, we have grown the business the last several years quite significantly, and yet we've cut carbon emissions intensity quite significantly as well, 66.8% carbon emissions intensity since our baseline that was set in 2019. So we've scaled the business while cutting carbon. And really the premise is, how do we run a more efficient business and a better business? So what we realized very early on at the company was, first and foremost, we needed to find a way to be a profitable business, because without being a profitable business, we weren't going to have the enduring sustainability, carbon, city impact that we wanted to have, right? We wouldn't exist as a company if we couldn't find a way to be profitable. So that was super, super important. What we also learned was that the sustainability goals that we had really went hand in hand, that if we could run a more efficient business, meaning that we would essentially waste less carbon, we're also wasting fewer dollars and we could become profitable faster. So we have done a whole number of things that have helped both be sort of serve both of those dual goals of profitability and sustainability. Some of the more significant things that we've done was we converted to having a swappable battery on our vehicles. And this gets a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's sort of worth noting a few examples. But originally the batteries were housed within the vehicle frame itself of the scooters, and similarly to the bikes, and it made it very hard to charge the batteries. You literally couldn't charge the batteries without taking the entire vehicle off the street to a charging depot, charging it and redeploying the vehicle. When we switched to a swappable battery, we could essentially take a fully charged battery out in the street, swap it into a vehicle, it would be off on its way and be available to riders, and it would essentially cut the operational impacts in half. Now, operational impacts in half means less spend on the operational costs and less carbon emitted and congestion of actually having to move vehicles from the street back to a charging depot and then redeploy them. So we increase uptime, we reduce costs, we reduce carbon. So really like a perfect example of how you can have both sustainability and profitability be mutually beneficial. Just one other example is that we have put a lot of investment in terms of hardware design to modularity and durability. And so we have vehicles that are lasting vastly longer than they did 8 years ago. And we have vehicles that can be more repairable and refurbished within our own warehouses so that we can keep vehicles on the street longer. So for example, if a particular part breaks off, we've designed intentionally so that we can swap that part out, get the vehicle back on the street, and someone's even fix that part and get it back into circulation. Or if that needs to be recycled, it can be recycled if it's beyond repair. So those things really help from a profitability perspective and really help from a sustainability perspective. And our biggest carbon impact is capital goods, our vehicles. That might be obvious, but worth stating that if we can keep vehicles on the street longer, if we can have more deployment with fewer purchases each year, that's going to reduce carbon, and it's also going to help our bottom line.
Yeah, I love that explanation because I feel that Lime has both it has like the product at its center that it's embedded in the business model, and that's why the more impact you have, the more profit that you make. But also, like, you've given all of these examples where like actively you also try to reduce the impact on all types of operations, not only in the main product that you sell, well, product or service, the bike or using the bikes. And that makes me reflect on the idea that you don't need to reinvent the system. You need to learn the language of the system so that you can use it to your own, to your own benefit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think in many ways, it's really incumbent upon companies like Lime to look for solutions that are out there and try to find partners with solutions that can help do that. And we certainly have done that in our decarbonization strategy, where another example is we're really committed to decarbonizing transportation and finding ways to move our vehicles to the markets that we serve with a lower carbon footprint. And so we've committed to zero emissions port to hub transportation. When we get a container of vehicles from a ship at our ports, we're now using zero emissions trucks to get them to our hubs in North America. And we're using HVO 100, which is a biofuel, recycled biofuel in Europe. And that is reducing the carbon impacts of just sort of the operational behind the scenes. And we're actually now looking at sort of the next leg of that journey of getting those vehicles from those hubs to the markets that we serve. And we're having some great success in Europe extending that HVO 100 use, which cuts carbon significantly. It's 90% less carbon intense than traditional diesel fuel. And of course, in North America, when we're using electric vehicles, and if it's produced on renewable energy, it's 100% less carbon than using that diesel. So really, we're making a lot of headway there, but we certainly know we have room to grow there. But I think it's incumbent upon us to think about, all right, how do we find solutions that are out there to help drive our decarbonization success and can keep the progress going?
Yeah. So we have Lime. We have a company that it's profitable, that it's growing, that has a positive impact in our environment. What does talent mean to you at Lime? So how do we get more people to be interested in these kinds of companies, but specifically at Lime?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a very mission-oriented company. I mean, people come to the company and they're maybe it's just because of the role that I'm in, but I think it's genuine that they say they just care about the mission and they feel such joy and purpose working for a company that has a purpose and that really cares about the work that we're doing. So I think that's a huge motivating factor. I think teams can do enormous things when they share a purpose and share a mission and feel that alignment. We also have a really like can-do culture. We run a business that is highly operational intense. We have warehouses that we operate. We have programs around the globe that we provide. There's an enormous amount of technology and backend that is required to facilitate the service, from ensuring that vehicles are in the right hotspots for commute hours to maintenance and predictive maintenance. It is operationally intense, but we have a really can-do culture of folks that want to work on a high-performing team, that like to set high targets and strive to achieve them. And I think our overarching net zero by 2030 science-based target is an example of that. Like, we've set this target and it gives something for the entire company to rally around, and we've seen success from that. So it's I think really about aligning a purpose-driven team with a high-performing and driven team that allows us to be, and I think allows teams to be in generally successful.
How do you think that having this purpose for the company that you work for, sharing this purpose with the people that you work with, how do you feel that that affects the the employee that is working for you, like the sense of belonging, or like the satisfaction, the engagement? Like, where have you seen that this purpose really has an impact on them?
Well, I think it's enormous. I mean, I think it's everything from attracting talent and attracting great talent, that people will come to us with great careers, but that they want to be doing something with more purpose. And so they come to a company like Lime. And I think, on the other end of the spectrum, it's like retaining great employees because they care about the purpose and they want to see us achieve the work. And then everything in between, from recruitment to retention to the work itself. I think it really goes back to having people feel a sense of a shared mission, and knowing that leadership on the team shares the mission, which is one of the most gratifying things to see, and have someone like Wayne, who's our CEO, truly care and embody the mission, and help sort of disseminate and drive that from the top. It's such an important part of company culture to see a shared sense of purpose. Everyone's going to be working really hard, right? That's sort of incumbent upon just professional work these days. Also, a lot of people are remote these days, and so we're all spending a lot of time on Zoom calls and in with little squares and little pixels. And I think that there's something incumbent upon, or something really helpful about having that mission enable you to drive through the hard work, the challenges of remote work, et cetera, to keep people really motivated towards a shared goal.
Yeah. Part of my research is to understand how this purpose affects employees. And recently I saw this fact that 40% of Gen Z leave their jobs before reaching 1 year.
Hmm.
And what I was reading was about how this purpose retain these talents, because Gen Z is a generation that it's going to fill 80% of the jobs in 10 years.
Mhm.
And they really need to be connected with what they do, because it's a generation that it's hyper aware of everything that's happening around us. Social media really lets you see all problems, from climate to hunger to inequality to everything. And so I feel that this is exactly what companies should be focusing on, and why the concept of social entrepreneurship is so powerful these days.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. It's an appropriate assessment of like what the different generations are looking for in their work. And one of the things that I see every day at Lime is people taking it upon themselves to sort of go above and beyond to
Mm.
further the mission. I mean, we have, take London, for example, we have an incredible team there that has been so creative about immersing ourselves and localizing ourselves. And some of the things that they do are both incredibly creative. They connect Lime to the community incredibly well, and they're fun. And I think they enjoy doing them. Like we had an example, we know that riders will often, or that one of the concerns that people have around riding and riding safely with a helmet is this notion of having helmet head. And so they did a pop-up salon in London to sort of combat or draw attention to, hey, you can still ride a bike safely and look great doing it. And it was a very fun, creative way to sort of embody the mission. And in some ways, I think is a reflection of a culture that enables people to be creative, to help find ways to live our mission in a really creative way, in a genuine way. And I think we see those examples happening around the globe all the time with our local teams.
So, Andrew, we're about to get to the end of the interview. I always like to pick up brains on the future of the industry. So, looking ahead 10 years from now, what do you think that cities will look like if Lime keeps growing and you guys manage to, or we as a society manage to change our perspective of what mobility looks like in our cities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really goes back to that vision that I shared a bit earlier around reducing car dependence and how much more livable our cities can be if we reduce the amount of space and prominence that cars have. The cities around the globe that we have are going to be taking in a vast amount of population growth by 2050. It's just all the modeling of the UN shows that cities are going to be where the population centers are. And frankly, that's where populations should go, right? Because that's where you can house, work, provide services to people most efficiently. But if we're going to do that, and if cities are going to be sort of the epicenter of population growth, we've got to do so smartly and sustainably. And so when I think about a city in 10 years, I would want to see a significant increase in the prominence of two-wheeled vehicles, of space that's given to parks and eateries and housing and things that allow people to live in a more hospitable way that makes cities really function well. And I think that necessitates removing and reducing the car dependence in the most sort of urban areas. And so, I think it's really flipping the script and thinking about how can we have cities that are built around people versus around a technology like a car, for example.
Yeah, good point. Also because like as humans, we have forgotten about the benefit of being surrounded by nature. Like a lot of us don't see nature on our day-to-days, and it has so many positive benefits for our mental health and for our well-being that if we manage to change how we move around cities, and as you said, if we manage to give less importance to cars, I think we'd have more space to have nature and to have livable spaces. And as a consequence, naturally, we would then feel better with ourselves, and we would feel better living in a city.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also even an extension beyond just nature, but just a connection to our community. I mean, when you are
Also,
on,
also,
when you're on a bike or a scooter and you're biking through neighborhoods, you're getting the sights, the smells, the sounds of the community in a way that you just don't get when you're in a 2,000 pound steel cage of a car. And you just have a different feeling when you're going through different parts of your community and you arrive at your destination, pulling right up to it, parking properly, of course, versus hunting for parking and being frustrated by
yeah,
parking, etc. Like you just feel better and feel more joy within the city and feel more
yeah,
connection to your community. So I think, sure, we should be reducing the amount of sort of space used for parking so we can have, parklets and urban parks and have people have a greater connection to nature, but people can also have a greater connection to their community and sort of fulfill this notion of a 15-minute city where you have access to all the things that you need within a 15-minute bike, scoot, or walk without having to get into a car so that we have cities that actually function around people more.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. You're totally right. Andrew, I have one last question for you. You are someone that you've had a very lengthy career in many different places. As I said at the beginning, actually, we started the interview with the same concept. You've worked for corporations, for the government. You've worked in policy, and you also founded Lime. And for me, you have something that it's like the definition of success, which is finding something that you really care about and turning it into your day-to-day job. I think that's very lucky to have. You've probably found your own luck, but I think not a lot of people can say that. Um, I guess my last question is, what is something that you would have liked to learn sooner in your career to maybe prioritize this alignment?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I think it's this back to this notion that you don't necessarily need to chart out a prescribed career progression to be totally fulfilled and have a successful and fun career. I think if you are connected to a mission or focused on finding purpose in the work that you do, the rest falls into place. That you might zig and zag a little bit to find those ultimate places that provide you that professional fulfillment, but you don't necessarily have to have a highly prescribed A plus B plus C equals D kind of formula. That you can sort of wend your way through it. If you're sort of committed to doing good work and committed to a mission of doing good work, I think you'll find your way. I mean, when I was working in government policy and in government and politics, I always had the notion of wanting to address the climate crisis in mind. And in many ways, some of the policy work and political work I was doing was a furtherance of that. But I didn't see myself going to the solar industry and didn't see myself going into what became micromobility either. And so I think that having sort of rooted in one's own self, the notion of trying to do and find good work and work that's fulfilling really is the ultimate thing. You're going to be happier. You're going to be more successful if you do.
I totally agree. I hope after this conversation, we're able to convince more people that they should listen to themselves a bit more and do something that it's more purposeful. Because then everything just starts falling into place serendipitously or less. Because again, like you can find or you can work for your own luck. But yeah, thank you so much. I've loved our conversation. I have been inspired myself. So I'm sure that we will be able to transmit this inspiration to all of our listeners. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudia. Really great to be with you, and thanks for all the good work you're doing.